Welcome back to Chapter 12, and this lesson we're going to talk about workflows. Now, I'm not one to suggest one workflow or the other, but there are some common basics that are necessary for any workflow and should be followed in a particular pattern. What I use for a workflow is what I've come up with that works for me. There are different workflows for photography, different flows for restoration, and also, if you have Photoshop, some of these steps can be combined into one. So I'm working with Photoshop Elements, and the workflow that I created is for Photoshop Elements. You're not going to have this, but you'll be able to see it at least in the video. So I'm going to right click here and open it. I'll double click 100% here. I'll move it into position. There we go. Perfect. Now these are the steps that I've come up with to create a workflow. And you'll notice that in parentheses on the top it says after color management and calibration. So this PSE workflow, I guess you would call it post-production. Okay. The first thing that I suggest is shoot in RAW. Always shoot in RAW if you can. If you cannot shoot in RAW, try to save it in TIFF. And the reason I say save it in TIFF is because it's a lossless compression. You don't lose any data each time you save it or work with it. And it's actually more well known. And it's for preservation type, it would be better to save it in a TIFF than a JPEG. Okay. Now, RAW usually has an extension. If you shoot with your camera, like usually it's a DSLR, it'll usually end in an NEF for Nikon or CR2 for Canon, if I'm right. Okay. RAW allows you more flexibility in editing a picture, and let's just say it doesn't provide any proprietariness. Okay, so the second thing I would do is once you've chosen to shoot in RAW, which you'll come to enjoy, you want to open your image in Camera Raw 16-bit. In the next tutorial, or next chapter, excuse me, I'll show you how to work in Camera Raw, but I'm just going to go over this briefly. So you want to open your image in Camera Raw in 16-bit. I also try to work in 16-bit for as far as I can before I convert to 8-bit. And I believe I've shown in a previous tutorial what levels would look like when you convert it, and you'll see how it worked. So after I open my image in Camera Raw, I can straighten it and or crop it. Now the nice thing about Camera Raw is if you don't like the straighten or you don't like the crop, you can always go back. So it's nothing hard and true. And that's the other good thing about Camera Raw. And when I say crop, I don't mean artistic crop. I mean crop out the obvious stuff. Okay. The fourth thing I would do is reduce noise. And the reason I say I want to reduce noise is because according to Topaz Labs, noise reduction software has a very specific idea of what noise looks like and what detail looks like straight out of a camera. So if you apply any adjustments to the image, it confuses the noise reduction software and it can cause you to give subpar results. So that's why I suggest as number 4. If for some reason in the Camera Raw the reduced noise is not working for you, then I would go ahead and open the image in Photoshop Elements and use its reduce noise capabilities under the filter menu, and then save it as working.psd. I don't think you'll need to provide the extension, but just make sure it says PSD. And the reason I say working, because if you know the word working, then that'll mean to you that it's still in 16-bit. Okay? And then you're going to reopen that into the Camera Raw. And then once you're in Camera Raw, number 5, you're going to work the Camera Raw sliders from the top down. So you'll see in the next chapter how you'll work from the top down. Number 6, open the image into Photoshop Elements and save as working 2. So once you've done all the slider work, noise reduction, straighten or crop, go ahead and save it as working 2. That means to you that it's still in 16-bit and that I've completed the steps 5 and above. Now number 7 says, this is a tricky one, okay? I'm going to warn you. This says apply 16-bit shadow, highlight, curves, and or levels under the enhance menu, and I have an asterisk. Okay? It says save each step as working S for shadow highlights, or working C for curves, or working L for levels, or you can save it as working 3, which means you did all of them. I want to let you know that these are permanent changes and they're not adjustment layers. In order to use adjustment layers in Photoshop Elements, you need to convert it to 8-bit, whereas in Photoshop you can work in 16-bit. Okay? So if it seems a little bit scary and you don't want to save after each one and you're having extra work and it's kind of driving you crazy and you want to take the chance, then go ahead and skip number 7 and this will start the conversion into 8-bit. Okay, I personally apply my 16-bit shadow highlights and then curves and levels as far as I can, and I save it as working 3 because I'm used to working with the photos for a while, for a long time, excuse me. Okay, now number 8 says once if you skip number 7 or you've done number 7, you're going to now double click on the background layer lock. This is going to ask you to rename the layer. You're going to rename it to original, and it's going to convert it to 8-bit. When you convert it to 8-bit, you'll see a whole bunch more options open up in Photoshop Elements. And the first thing I always do is duplicate the layer, Control plus J, Control plus J. That's so you can view a before and after look, because you know when you work on a photo, your eyes get used to something. Well, sometimes you may forget what the original looked like, and plus you don't want to harm the original. So it's always good to duplicate the layer, and I usually turn off the original, but if you want to leave it on, that's okay. And once I duplicate the layer, then I save it as editing. And editing, which you've already noticed that Photoshop Elements already does that if you save it in a version set, means that it's an 8-bit. So I thought I'd provide that also for you. Now for number 11, at this point I will go in and remove any keystoning. You know, the barreling, the pinching, the horizontal and vertical distortion under the guided section. Now you probably would say, well, how come you don't want to fix that earlier? Well, because unfortunately under the guided section you have to work in 8-bit, and I don't want to convert to 8-bit unless I have to. So this is when I then do the keystoning. Okay, if you need to. Maybe some pictures you don't need to do keystoning. Some of these can be skipped if you don't need to do them. That's fine. Number 12, once I've got rid of the keystoning, then I'll go ahead and remove the chromatic aberration. And you'll see in the next tutorial how to do that, and also noise reduction. But to remove chromatic aberration, I'll usually add a hue saturation adjustment layer, pick the color, and then remove the saturation. And then I also look at it before and after so I can see how it looks, and then I'll save it. And I'll still save it as editing because these are extra adjustment layers and extra layers, so I'm not really harming the original. I'm not being destructive, so I can still save it as editing. Okay. Then number 13, which is a common thing that you'll hear throughout the industry, is you're going to press Control Alt Shift E. And when you press Control Alt Shift E, this will merge all the layers below to all the visible layers, I guess you would say, to a layer that has everything together. So this Control Alt Shift E was considered a stamped layer, and it has the chromatic, the keystoning, everything else done already, and it's combined into one. So you can work from this layer forward, which is better. Okay. And also, if you want to do any adjustments, then you don't need to duplicate the layer again because adjustment layers are non-destructive. But if you're going to use items under the Enhance menu, you may need to duplicate that new stamped layer by pressing Ctrl J again, which will make a copy of the stamped layer so you can see it before and after. And it also saves you time because you don't want to redo things back. You always want to move forward. Number 14. At this point, you may want to go Save as Editing 2. Now, Save as Editing 2 means that the stuff is 8-bit and above done, and this way you can work on touch-ups. This save as editing 2 is up to you because you're still not being destructive at this point, but if you were using anything under that enhance menu, you might want to save it as editing 2. And also you can work on touch-ups at this point. Always try the slimming first because slimming actually changes the photo and restoration work can be done at this point if you want. Number 15, I also, after I'm done with all this stuff, I create another stamped layer, and from that stamped layer, I add effects, and also the famous S-curve to increase the contrast to make it look very nice. And sometimes I do a little luminosity masking, which I have on the Photoshop and Elements.com website, a tutorial to show you how to do that. And then I save it again. And then lastly, if you need to reduce your image, then I would reduce my image at that point. If you need to. If you don't worry about it. But if you do need to reduce the image first, then sharpen, then finally save for the web, or you're going to do print. If you do not need to reduce the image, then go ahead and sharpen, and then you can save for the web or print. In the next lesson, we're going to talk about how to reduce noise.